Hello, I'm Crystal Petry, and you are watching the Crystal Petry Podcast. We are continuing our coverage, of President Trump's first 100 days in office. And here to help us break down the latest goings-ons, we have Seth Daniels. So how are you, Seth?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. Welcome back to the podcast because you were on before. You were one of our first guests. You and Winslow were one of our first guests when we first started our coverage of President Trump's 100 days. So thanks for joining us again.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's just hop right into it because as you and I were talking, it's so much that goes on constantly. I do this about once a week. I feel like I need to start doing it every day almost. It's so much going on. Okay, so the latest thing, like the big news coming out of DC, is President Trump trying to get rid of the Department of Education. What are your thoughts on this?
hmm Yeah, many Republicans have run for president or Senate or Congress or something over the years on this idea of getting rid of the federal Department of Education. It is not because Republicans are anti-education, but it's because in our our system of federalism, education is one of those functions that is primarily handled at the state level and at the local level, really, even more so than the state, and that really gives parents a lot more control over education for their children than DC calling those shots. Department of Education's been around, I think, since Jimmy Carter
Correct.
started it.
Yes.
And since the creation of the Department of Education, we have spent more money on education and have had poorer outcomes. So the idea is that to take Washington out of it and delegate that back to the states and give state and local communities and parents more control over education, we can reverse those trends of declining outcomes.
Does this idea or action, because President Trump is putting into action to get rid of the federal Department of Education, does this align with his America's First ideology, you think?
I think so. I don't know what sort of bullet point under America First would cover education, but if it's about giving parents more control over the education of their children, then I would say so. And the other thing that I would mention too, I talked a little bit about, we've spent more money and gotten worse outcomes, is that between when Congress appropriates money for education and it goes through the Department of Education, is sent down to the states, and then the compliance and the monitoring costs to the state and local school boards to uh, keep that money and get that money, you end up losing about 30 cents on the dollar that we spend on education.
Let's go back to President Trump's first term, where his Secretary of Education was Betsy DeVos. And it was kind of her idea. I'll give her ownership to the best of my knowledge, kind of her idea for this disillusion of the Department of Education at the federal level and move it to the state level. What do you think about her, I guess, forward thinking in this process so long ago?
hmm I think that she was maybe the first Secretary of Education to really get on board with it, or to at least be, so vocal about it. It's not a new idea, but she was kind of one of the first secretaries of education to um, really lean into the idea.
And she is still, I mean, she's not in federal office anymore, but she is still a huge proponent of leaving the education to the state and to the parents, as you stated before. So she's still a very vocal part of this, even though she's not in the White House anymore. Uh,
hmm
are there any or what would you say are some major criticisms from educators about Trump's education policy and wanting to get it out of the federal hands and move it to the state hands?
Hmm. Um, well, I know that, Donald Trump and Betsy DeVos are both big advocates for school choice, and I think that is probably the policy that catches the most criticism from a lot of people. And I'm support school choice, but I'm also sensitive to the idea of not defunding, not decreasing funding for public schools. I'm a product of public schools. I don't think I've ever been inside a private school actually, and but so that's sort of the debate. There is school choice sounds great, but how do you ensure that the students at the traditional public schools, and charter schools are public schools, um, how do you make sure that they are not disadvantaged by creating choice for parents and students?
Excellent. Before we move on, Seth, just so my audience will be clear on what school choice is, can you just explain that to us briefly? What is school choice?
Hmm. Yeah, school choice is the idea that really comes from the idea that a student's opportunities, education opportunities, should not be limited by their zip code. And particularly when you have somebody, a student that maybe has special needs, that if there are better resources or better opportunities for a different school to address those special needs, whether that is a disability, a learning disability, developmental disability, or maybe you have an exceptional student who doesn't have the opportunity to be challenged and grow at their school that they would be traditionally zoned for, allowing the parents and the student to choose the best environment for them to learn in.
Okay.
That is where it comes from, and sometimes those options are private schools, sometimes they're charter schools, sometimes they are other. You can move between public schools that you're not zoned for, but often there's a cost offset there, something that would be incurred. And so school choice is kind of inclusive of all those options. Also includes, when we talk about vouchers, people talk about vouchers. It's not just to go to a private school, it can be for things like tutoring and additional resources that the student needs.
And I know you mentioned it earlier with school choice and the vouchers. My understanding is they would take some funding from public schools to create these vouchers for people who qualify or for families who want to use those to go to charter schools and or to go to private schools as well. So
Hmm.
that's where there's a huge debate, if you will, about school choice. Do we need school choice? Public schools losing funding because of this idea. So I just wanted to make sure that my audience was very
Yeah.
clear on what that is. Let's move on to tariffs. We have heard about tariffs since President Trump was campaigning, I feel like. And he has come into the office and stated that he is going to do reciprocal tariffs on Canada and Mexico and other countries, but specifically those two. Explain to us what are tariffs and what is President Trump wanting to accomplish with that?
Hmm. Yeah. Tariffs are a tax on items that are and products that are imported from one country into ours. And the reciprocal tariff would be, or a reciprocal tariff would be, if you're taxing our stuff coming into your country at this amount, 10%, 25, whatever it is, then we're going to do the same thing when your stuff comes into our country.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the idea behind it is that, particularly when other countries that we have trading partnerships with are taxing our exports coming into their country, uh, and we are not taxing their products when they are imported into our country. Um, that it's not a level playing field. And if we're going to be, trading partners, let's be partners. A reciprocal tariff of zero is a 0% tariff on both parties.
And I think whichever side of the aisle you on, I feel like there can be some neutral ground there, because the understanding is, just like you explained, Seth, that they tax us, but we don't tax them,
Mm-hmm.
which in any game is not fair. If you
Right.
get the ball and I never get the ball, it's not fair in any game that you play. So I feel like on whatever side of the aisle you on, there should be some kind of neutral agreement on that. Now, President Trump, as I stated before, has been stating that he's going to put tariffs on Canada and Mexico, other countries as well. But this week, I think actually yesterday on Thursday, he came out and stated that he was going to pause the tariffs for 30 days because the top three automakers went to him and spoke to him about that. Why do you think the top three automakers went to President Trump and asked him to put a hold on these tariffs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think something that maybe has been lost in the discussion about tariffs is that it's not just the final product. We're not talking about cars as a product where, if these tariffs are not um, carefully done, that there are components of, say, a Kia vehicle, that we have a Kia manufacturing plant here in Georgia, that if it's not, that some of the components may be made in Mexico or Canada or Ohio or something like that, and then they're brought to Georgia where they're assembled for final assembly, and then that final product, cars, but then goes out into the market for consumers like you and I. And I don't think I realized before this tariff debate how much of that component manufacturing is spread out, and throughout the course of uh, the manufacturing and assembly of a car, a part may start in the United States, go to Canada, come back to the United States. There may be parts that came from Mexico that then meet back in the United States after it was in Canada, and then eventually it all goes to the assembly plant. So, we have had trade agreements in place with Canada and Mexico for decades. This was NAFTA, I think, started in the Clinton administration, if I'm right, or maybe I think started with George H.W. Bush and signed by Clinton. That sounds right. But so we have had, so for the past 3 decades, going
Right.
on 4 decades, we have had trade agreements in place that have made this a mutually beneficial arrangement to spread that manufacturing out across North America, Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and to sort of try to put that toothpaste back in the tube is going to be a messy process.
That is going to be a messy process. And so while you're speaking, I quickly looked it up, and you are correct. President Clinton signed that into law on December 8th, 1993, and it went into effect January 1, 1994. So it sounded correct, and it was correct. It was correct. So how does the tariffs, and before I get to this next question, I just want to piggyback on something you said, Seth. I know you openly admitted that you didn't fully gauge like tariffs and how many parts are created outside of the country and brought back into the country. But not just you. I think the majority of Americans, including myself, did not realize how much of American products we have that are made outside of the United States. I know we're talking about cars here, but not just auto parts. There are several things, medicines, clothing, that are made outside of the United States that come back into the United States. So the tariffs would we as a consumer would see that price increase with the tariffs. How do you think the tariffs and the pause on the tariffs is going to affect our auto workers?
So to pause the tariffs would be to maintain the status quo that we have now. I think the intent behind this tariff policy is to attract back some of that component manufacturing to the United States. Um, I think when President Trump and Vice President Vance and others talk about revitalizing the American manufacturing industry, again, it's not just the final product that goes to the market that you and I buy that has to be considered here. It's also the components, the business to business manufacturing, and that when those manufacturing jobs in the Rust Belt, they call it, dried up. It wasn't just that GM closed up a plant and moved it to Mexico. It was probably even before GM did. It was those component manufacturers that moved to other countries and reduced their output at those plants. And so that has that effect where it's not just the final product, it's everything that leads up to that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So if you bring some of that back, you have more jobs here and things like that. But of course, there was a reason why they moved to Mexico in the first place.
Exactly. Exactly. So when President Trump put a pause on the tariffs, he gave the top three automakers 30 days for the pause. Why do you think he put a timeline on that? Is it for them to get their ducks in order, so to speak, or what do you think?
Um, so I'm not totally sure. Surely he does not expect anybody to realign their logistics and supply
In 30
chains in
days.
30 days. That ain't going to work. But if it's more time for negotiation, particularly not even so much with the manufacturers, but with Mexico and Canada, 30 days makes sense for a negotiation timeline, does not make sense for a logistics and supply chain realignment.
Absolutely. Okay, and so our final topic for this podcast is President Trump went before Congress earlier this week and gave his speech at the joint sessions of Congress, and this was his fifth time, first time for his second term. We will kind of break down some of the things that he spoke about, but first, what was your overall thought and feelings about that joint meeting?
That he never stops campaigning. It just sort of started off immediately on a more of a political rhetoric note than what we typically see in these sorts of addresses to joint session of Congress, and that was picked up on by the members of Congress because there was some outbursts and protest and pretty much right out of the gate.
Absolutely right out of the gate. Now, before I get to my question, Seth, I just have to say this: when presidents go before Congress to do this annual speech that they give, it has gotten worse where Republican presidents, the Republicans will stand and cheer and applaud, and the Democrats will sit there and do nothing. Or vice versa, if you have a Democratic president, the Democrats will cheer and applaud and support, and the Republicans will sit there and say nothing. Can we come to some kind of neutral ground here, especially when you have presidents speaking about, like, for example, President Trump was speaking about a young boy who had brain cancer and was talking about trying to, help and put things in place to save the little boy's life. The Republicans stood and cheered and supported. The Democrats did nothing. And it's
Mm-hmm.
been the same with a Democratic president and the Democrats cheering. I feel like at some point in time, the human side of us should be the priority instead of the political party side of us.
Right. I agree, and you're right, and it's not just the sitting there doing nothing. It's the booing, it's the yelling, "You lie!" Somebody did to President Obama. This
Yes.
has been. You're 100% right. It's gotten worse. Um, it seems to get a little bit worse every time, and I don't know. I mean, I mentioned that the tenor of the speech off the start was, sort of political. I think that is part of it, and that has also gotten worse. Trump did it with this one. There have been speeches from President Biden that I thought, well, this is awfully political, and Trump's first term, and President Obama as well. And part of that's natural. I mean, you're the president, you have a joint session of Congress. Part of the function of the speech is to talk about your agenda and to brag about the things that you've accomplished, and have Americans cheer for you while you talk about those achievements, and then to sort of lay out what you want to do next, what you identify as the problems and the solutions that you'd like to pursue. So there is sort of an inherent political nature to that people, Republicans and Democrats, can disagree on. You don't have to boo and yell and hiss, whatever, for that. You can, to that point, if you want to sit there with your arms crossed, that is fine. But you're right. I mean, to sit there with your arms crossed and I don't think anyone booed, but to, maybe booed in their mind of the young boy with brain cancer, talking about wanting to be a police officer and getting sworn in as an honorary Secret Service agent. Yeah, I mean, come on. That was a big day for him. And if you saw his dad, he was so proud of his son and so happy to be there. Um, Come on, clap for that.
Clap for that. The human side of us needs to
Mm-hmm.
prevail at some point in time during this time. Okay, so Seth, what were some of the key things that jumped out at you during President Trump's speech?
I was sort of half watching it. I did have it on, and I was doing some other things, and you know, I remember he talked about the decrease in apprehensions at the border, that there
Mm-hmm.
are fewer border crossings now. The message that a new sheriff is in town has been sent and received, and so there are fewer people trying to enter the country illegally now. And beyond that, he did highlight some specific cases of families that were impacted by the illegal immigration or the lax enforcement of immigration laws over the past 4 years. One of them was Laken Riley,
Mm-hmm.
University of Georgia nursing student. I'm a University of Georgia alum. Actually lived across the street from the apartment where her murderer was arrested. And so, that one was, close to home. And so he talked about Laken Riley. He talked about in the bill, I think the first bill he signed when he came into, first actual bill that passed through Congress that he signed when he came into office this time was a bill that um, would sort of increase or expand the conditions where someone would be deported, because the man that killed her had been previously arrested on a misdemeanor shoplifting crime, which under the previous law was not enough to initiate deportment proceedings. Um, and there were a few other families that had similarly tragic stories from illegal immigrants that had committed crimes against their families. That stood out to me. That, of course, was one of the biggest things that he ran on, was stopping this illegal immigration and the people, the criminal actors that come through illegally, that we just if we can stop illegal immigration, focus just on legal immigration, then we have a better idea of who's coming in.
Right.
Of Atlanta.
President
Yeah.
Trump has been in office a little bit over a month now. As a young Republican, are you satisfied with what he's done so far? Is the things that he campaigned on, the things that he's doing now? What are your overall thoughts this far into his term?
hmm I think there have been some big wins and some things that his supporters and people that voted for him are very happy to see. Um, you and I were talking before we started recording that it has been so much to keep up with,
Yes.
and I think in that torrent of things, it's not just difficult to keep up with, but if not that President Trump listens to me, but if I had one piece of advice, it would be like, let's slow it down a little bit and just be a little bit more careful about some of the things as they go into effect. We talked about delaying the tariffs for 30 days. Well, okay. Is that because you need more time to figure out what you actually want to do? Some of the there was a freeze on federal spending that suddenly threw a lot of people around the country, made them pause because it's a wait to say, what does
Yes.
that mean for our Medicaid, Medicare spending, things like that. I think the American public is behind this administration all the way in cutting out the waste, fraud, and abuse, and let's figure out how many federal employees do we actually need, what is the actual proper role of the federal government, are we spending money on things that we ought not be spending money on. So I don't think that he'll lose support if he takes it down a gear and is just a little bit more deliberate in how some of these things are done, and it saves them from having to go back and delay or redo or undo.
Absolutely. Okay, so as we get ready to say goodbye, Seth, daylight savings time is coming up. So everyone has a thought and opinion on that. Daylight savings time is like Sunday morning. So you gotta adjust your clock. Saturday night, it's spring. So you spring forward, you move your clock an hour forward. President Trump stated just today on Friday, March the 7th, that he wanted to look into getting rid of daylight savings time. Now, for me, I'm like, should the president even care about daylight savings time? But evidently he does. What are your thoughts on daylight savings time? Everybody else has an opinion on it. What is yours?
Yeah. So are we going into daylight savings time? Are we saving the daylight this summer, or have we been saving the daylight? I'm not sure which one is the savings time and which one is the standard time. I don't know. I like the summer. I like the long days. I like it warm.
Yes.
I like the sun in Georgia where I live, the sun goes down late summer or midsummer around like 8:30. So I don't know which one is which. I would be happy if this Monday or Sunday is the last time that we have to change the clock. I don't know if we'll get it done. I hope so. Whatever we're going into with the long summer days, that's what I want. Let's keep it that way. I'm tired of the flipping back and forth, and I never know when it is. I'm glad my phone does it automatically, or
Yes.
I'll be, an hour late to everything next week. But it is, almost every state does this. Arizona, for whatever reason, does
They
not
do
do it.
not.
I guess they just have so much sun in Arizona that they said we don't need to save any daylight at any
Yes,
point
and
in
we're
the
going to
year.
throw everybody else off in the country.
Yeah. So I don't know what time it is in Arizona. But yeah, it is. Every state does it. There is a federal law for daylight savings time, and I'm ready. I'm with them. Whatever we're about to do, let it be the last time.
I agree with you, Beth. Whatever we do, Let's keep it. No more changing back and forth. Fall, what is it? Fall backwards, spring forward. Look, I don't even know the thing. Yeah, let's be done with it. Leave it whatever way. But I do enjoy long days, same as you. Long, warm days as much as possible, same as you. Especially when I was a child, because I had to come in before the street lights came on, which makes I get to
So
stay
there
out.
you go. I mean,
I get to stay out longer.
Yeah.
Okay, Seth, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Seth is the executive vice president of the Young Republicans of Georgia. Thank you so much. And we will have you back on a little bit later on in President Trump's 100 days to get your thoughts and opinions on what he's doing for the country.
All right. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Crystal.
Absolutely. You are so welcome, Seth. And thank you for joining us. And to my listeners, to my audience, thank you so much for tuning in. We will follow President Trump's first 100 days until the final 100th day to keep you updated and to keep ourselves updated. You can get Seth's podcast on YouTube Podcasts and Apple Podcasts. And remember, you always have time to listen and learn on the go.